Provo County, Utah Territory, November 1886. The cold had come early and it had come mean. 7 consecutive nights had already dropped below zero, and families across the valley were burning through their winter wood faster than any of them had planned. At the northern edge of Harmon Flats, where the land dipped low and the hill rose sharp behind it, something strange had been under construction since September. From the road it looked like a hole, a mound, a mistake. The kind of thing a grieving woman might start and never finish. But inside that mound, something no one in the county had expected was already taking shape. Her name was Clara Maud Engstrom. She was 34 years old. She had eyes the color of sage after rain and hands that had not been soft since August. They stopped believing she would fail on the morning of December 9, 1886. Her husband, Rolf Engstrom, had been dead since March 14th of that same year. He had gone across the Green River crossing with 2 other men from the settlement, hauling lumber back from the mill at Castle Gate. The water was running fast with snowmelt. The second raft broke loose from its tow line and Rolf went in trying to catch it. The river took him 80 yards downstream before anyone could reach a rope to him. They found him 2 days later caught in the willows. He was 41 years old. He had left behind a daughter named Astrid, who was 9, and a son named Birk, who was 6, and a debt of $230 owed to the Deseret Land and Cattle Company for the lease on their 40 acres, and a woodpile that would not last past January. Clara's position after his death was the lowest the valley had a name for. Widow, debtor, woman with children, and no male relation within 300 miles. The community did not hate her. They simply expected her to dissolve, to sell the lease back to the company, to move in with the Halverson family on the east side of the settlement, where Ingrid Halverson had already offered a back room with a cot and a stove. That was what a woman in her situation did. That was what made sense. Garrett Foss at the grain exchange told his wife that Clara Engstrom had lost more than her husband that day on the river. He meant her sense. He said it twice. Nils Bauer, who ran the lending office out of the back of the dry goods store, said she had 60 days before she would be walking into his office and signing the papers to hand the land back. He had the papers already drawn. What neither man knew, and what Clara had never spoken aloud to anyone in Harmon Flats, was what she had grown up knowing. Her father, Oskar Lindgren, had been a groundskeeper and stonemason outside of Falun, Sweden, before the family emigrated in 1864. He had built in the old Scandinavian tradition, half underground, earth banked to the windows, the hillside itself made part of the wall. He had explained to Clara when she was small, standing in his workshop with her feet in the wood shavings, that the ground 15 feet down held a temperature that did not change much regardless of what the sky was doing above it. He called it the Earth's own warmth. He said it was the most reliable thing in a cold world. Clara had carried that knowledge for 22 years without a reason to use it. Now she had a reason. The public place where it started was McCreary's General Store on the morning of October 3, 1886. Clara had come in for lamp oil and a sack of dried beans. She had not come for conversation. But conversation found her anyway. Desmond Holt was there. He was 47 years old, and he had built 31 structures across Utah Territory and survived 19 winters in the high country. He was the man other men called when something needed to stand for longer than one season. He had a beard like a gray river and an opinion on everything built from wood or stone within 50 miles. When he heard what Clara Engstrom was digging into the hillside behind her property, he set down his tin of tobacco and he looked at her the way a man looks at a child who has just announced a plan to fly. He told her the ground would not hold. He said the frost line in that particular hillside went down 4 feet minimum, and that any structure dug into unstable glacial till would shift and crack before February. He said the moisture seeping through earthen walls would turn to ice and split whatever she used for mortar. He gave her his specific prediction. He said she would be back in a timber cabin by Christmas if she was smart, and back in the Halverson backroom by January if she was not. 31 structures, he said. I know what holds. Clara picked up her lamp oil. She looked at him for a moment. So do I, she said. Then she walked out. Nils Bauer was also in the store that morning. He had heard every word. He stepped forward after Clara left and told Desmond Holt that it did not matter what she built, because the land debt would come due on December 1st, and he had the authority from the Deseret Land and Cattle Company to begin seizure proceedings on December 2nd if the $230 was not paid in full. He said this calmly, the way a man states a fact about the weather. The authority was real. The papers were real. The cruelty of it was entirely official. He straightened his coat and left without buying anything. Clara broke ground on September 6th. She had no help except what Astrid and Birk could give her and what her own body could absorb. The hillside behind the house rose at a gentle angle for 40 feet before it steepened. She had chosen the spot in August, walking the hill 3 times at different hours of the day, pressing her palms into the earth, measuring the slope with a length of rope and a weighted line her father had taught her to make. She chose the location where the hill was 15 feet thick at the surface and where a natural shelf of sandstone ran horizontally through the clay at 9 feet down. That shelf would be her floor. She dug the entrance tunnel first. It ran 8 feet into the hill at a downward angle of 12 degrees, deliberately angled so that cold air, which sank and pooled, would collect at the tunnel floor and not flow freely into the main chamber. She had remembered her father explaining this. Cold air was lazy, he said. Give it a low place to sit, and it will sit there and bother nothing above it. The main chamber was 14 feet wide by 18 feet long. The ceiling at its highest point was 6 feet 4 inches, which was low enough to hold warmth close to the people living under it, but high enough that a grown person could stand without stooping. She used sandstone pulled from the hill itself for the walls, laying it dry at first, then mortaring with a mixture of clay and straw she had spent 2 weeks preparing in a wooden trough beside the creek. She filled the gaps with smaller stones and packed everything with dense clay. Her hands blistered in the first week. By the end of the second week, the blisters had opened and closed, and the skin beneath had turned to something closer to bark than flesh. A sandstone edge caught her left thumb on the 14th day, and the nail went black and stayed black for a month. She stopped noticing the weight of the stones somewhere around the 3rd week. She simply moved them. Birk, who was 6, carried water in a bucket that was too heavy for him and dragged it with both hands and never once complained. Astrid, who was 9, learned to mix the clay mortar to the right consistency by feel, the way Clara showed her, pressing her fist in and watching how it held its shape. On the days when school let out early, Astrid worked until it was too dark to see. By the end of the first week, Clara had completed the entrance tunnel and begun the main chamber walls. 2 weeks in, the walls stood 4 feet high on 3 sides. By early October, the roof timbers were going in. She used 8 salvaged pine beams, each 12 inches wide and 4 inches thick, laid across the chamber at 2-foot intervals, then covered them with birch bark layered in 3 courses to shed water, then 18 inches of packed earth on top of that, seeded with grass she had cut and dried specifically for this purpose. The grass roots would bind the earth. Her father had told her that too. A neighbor named Wendell Price passed by on the 2nd Thursday of October. He stopped his mule and looked at the mound for a long time. "That a root cellar?" he asked. "No," Clara said. He looked another moment. Then he clicked his tongue at the mule and moved on. By October 19th, the structure was sealed. The small cast iron stove she had moved from the house fit through the entrance tunnel on its side with 2 inches to spare. The chimney pipe ran up through the earth ceiling at a shallow angle, emerging from the hillside 4 feet above the chamber roof. It drew well. It did not need to burn large. Her dress hung loose by the time the roof was finished. Her cheeks had hollowed. She had stopped counting the aches in her lower back somewhere in the 5th week because counting them gave them too much importance. Dirt had worked into the creases of her knuckles so deep that washing no longer reached it. She did not mind. The work was done. The first real test came on the night of November 4th, 1886. The temperature dropped to 17 below zero between sundown and midnight. It was not the worst the valley would see that winter, but it was cold enough to freeze the water in a bucket left 3 feet from a burning stove. And cold enough that 2 families on the east side of the settlement woke to find their pipes burst and their floors wet and freezing. Wendell Price came by the next morning. He had not planned to stop. He was checking his fence line along the lower field, and the path took him past the hill. He saw smoke rising from the low chimney pipe in the earth, and he stopped. He knocked on the tunnel entrance, which Clara had fitted with a heavy door of doubled pine planks stuffed between with dried moss. Clara opened it. The air that came out of that tunnel hit Wendell Price in the face like something from a different season. He stepped inside without being invited. He walked the length of the tunnel and into the main chamber, and he stood there in his heavy coat, and his breath did not cloud. He pressed his palm flat against the south wall. The stone was not warm exactly, but it was not cold either. It held a temperature that had no business existing on a 17 below night in November. He looked at the thermometer Clara had hung on the center post. It read 41 degrees Fahrenheit inside the chamber. Outside it was 17 below. That was a difference of 58 degrees between one wall and the other side of the hill. He did not say much. He looked at the thermometer a second time. He looked at the stove, which held only a small fire, the kind a person might build to warm their hands over rather than to heat a room. "Winter's barely started," he said finally. Clara nodded once. She poured him a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. He drank it standing up. Then he left. The real test was still coming, and everyone in the valley knew it. Clara knew it too. She went back to her routine. She checked the mortar lines. She banked the tunnel entrance with additional sod. She added a second layer of birch bark over the section of roof that faced northwest, because her father had told her the northwest was where the cold came from in this part of the world, and she saw no reason to doubt him. Before we go further, has anyone in your family ever built something like this to survive? Share it below. These stories deserve to be heard. The sky over Harmon Flats changed on the morning of December 7, 1886. It changed the way skies change when something serious is coming. The clouds came in from the northwest, low and gray, and moving faster than clouds had any right to move in still air. The temperature at sunrise was 4 below zero. By 10 in the morning it was 11 below. By 2 in the afternoon it was 19 below and still dropping. That was a fall of 15 degrees in 8 hours, and the old men in the settlement who had been watching skies for 40 years said they had not seen a drop that fast since the winter of 1872. The wind arrived that evening. It did not build slowly. It arrived at full strength the way a door flies open, sudden and total, and it found every crack in every wall in the valley, and it pushed through those cracks as though it had been given specific instructions. It drove snow horizontally across the flats at speeds that made the drifts pile against the south sides of cabins to the height of a man's shoulder in under 3 hours. Desmond Holt's cabin on the north edge of the settlement was a well-built structure, 22 feet by 30 feet, with timber walls 18 inches thick and a good stone chimney. By the night of December 7th, he was burning 4 logs every 2 hours to hold the interior temperature above freezing. His thermometer read 29 degrees inside despite the fire. Outside, the temperature had reached 37 below zero. The Bauer family, who lived in a frame house near the lending office, were burning through their wood so fast that Nils Bauer had sent his oldest boy to knock on 3 neighbors' doors asking to borrow split wood before midnight. The neighbors had their own fires to feed. In the main chamber under the hill, Clara fed the small stove 2 logs at 9 in the evening. She would not feed it again until morning. The thermometer on the center post read 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, 37 below. That was a difference of 81 degrees between inside and outside the hill. Astrid slept under 2 wool blankets on her cot. Birk had pushed his cot against the south wall because he said the wall was the warmest thing he had ever leaned against. Neither child woke during the night. Desmond Holt burned 40 logs between sundown and sunrise. Clara burned 6 logs total over the same period. Holt's cabin held 29 degrees. Clara's chamber held 44. The families at the settlement spent that night feeding fires every 90 minutes or burning furniture when the wood ran short. Clara spent it sleeping. The second crisis arrived at 2 in the morning on December 8th, while the storm was still at full force outside. Birk woke up coughing. Clara heard it immediately. She was a light sleeper the way all mothers with young children in dangerous places become light sleepers, her body tuned to the sounds of her children the way an instrument is tuned to a single note. She was beside his cot before she was fully awake. She pressed her palm to his forehead. He was burning. The fever had come fast and hard, the way fevers come in children, without warning and without negotiation. His skin was dry and his eyes, when he opened them, were glassy and too bright. Outside, the storm drove snow against the hill with a sound like thrown gravel. Inside the chamber, the thermometer read 42 degrees. Clara had no doctor within 12 miles. The roads were buried. The temperature outside was 39 below zero by 2 in the morning, the coldest point of the storm, a cold that would kill a person in under 20 minutes of exposure. There was no going for help. There was no sending Astrid. There was only what she had and what she knew. She built the fire up slightly. She melted snow in the cook pot and added dried yarrow from the bundle she kept hung near the chimney pipe, which her grandmother in Sweden had used for fever, and which Clara had gathered every summer without ever thinking she would need it for something this serious. She spooned the tea into birk slowly. She kept the stove at a steady burn and watched the thermometer. Then, at 4 in the morning, she made the decision that terrified her more than anything she had done since March. She let the fire go low. Not out, but low. A banked coal, nothing more. She needed to know if the structure itself held without the stove's help. She needed to know if the earth around them was doing what her father had promised it would do. She could not go into another night uncertain. She watched the thermometer. 1 hour passed. The temperature in the chamber dropped from 43 degrees to 40 degrees. 2 hours passed. It dropped from 40 degrees to 38 degrees. 3 hours passed. It held at 38 degrees and stopped falling. The earth was holding. The sandstone walls that had spent 8 weeks absorbing the ground's own temperature were giving it back. The ceiling of packed earth and birch bark and 18 inches of sod was holding the warmth in like a closed fist. 38 degrees with almost no fire. Outside it was still 39 below. Astrid woke at 5 in the morning and found her mother sitting on the stool beside Burke's cot, watching him breathe. "Is he going to be all right?" Astrid asked. She was 9 years old, and she asked the question the way a 9-year-old asks it, which is without any shield between herself and the answer. Clara looked at her daughter for a moment. Then she said, "The ground is holding us." Astrid looked at the walls. She looked at the thermometer. She looked back at her mother. "I know," she said. And she went back to her cot and pulled the blanket up and went back to sleep with the certainty of a child who has decided to trust the person beside her. Burke's fever broke at 7 in the morning. He was weak and quiet, and he drank 2 full cups of yarrow tea and asked if he could have cornbread when the storm was over. Clara said yes. She built the fire back up. She did not cry. She sat on the stool a while longer with her hand resting lightly on the blanket over his feet. The storm broke on the morning of December 9th. It did not ease gradually. It simply stopped, the way the most serious things sometimes simply stop, and left behind a silence so complete that the settlement sounded like a place that had forgotten what sound was. Wendell Price came across the flats at 8 in the morning expecting to find tragedy. He had spent the night in his own cabin burning wood at a rate that frightened him and holding 31 degrees with everything he had. His wife had kept the children in bed under every blanket in the house. He had thought about Clara Engstrom and her children twice during the night, both times with a guilt he could not entirely name. He came across the field through drifts that reached his thigh in places, following the line of the fence posts to keep his direction. The snow had sculpted itself into shapes that made familiar landmarks strange. He could not see the hill at first. He could only see the unbroken white surface of the field and the gray sky above it and his own breath. Then he saw the chimney smoke. Low and steady and thin against the sky, the way a fire burns when it does not need to work very hard. He stopped walking. Clara was outside. She was hanging a blanket over the tunnel entrance to air it, her arms raised, her boots sunk 4 inches into the crust of the snow. She was not wearing her heavy coat. She had her wool shawl over her shoulders and nothing more. The temperature outside was 11 below zero. Wendell Price stood at the edge of the field for a long moment with his scarf still pulled over his mouth and watched her hang the blanket in 11 below air without the expression of someone who was suffering. He walked to the entrance. She held the tunnel door open for him. He removed his coat inside the tunnel without thinking about it. By the time he reached the main chamber, he was already too warm in his heavy wool shirt. He looked at the thermometer on the center post. 46 degrees Fahrenheit. The stove held a small fire. 2 logs, burning quietly. He stood there with his coat over his arm. "That is warmer than my house," he said. With the stove burning all night. Clara handed him a cup of coffee. He took it. Desmond Holt came separately, later that afternoon. He came alone and he did not announce himself. Clara heard his boots on the tunnel floor and looked up from the table where she was mending Burke's wool stocking. Holt walked the perimeter of the chamber slowly. He pressed his palm flat against the sandstone south wall and held it there. He examined the roof timbers. He looked at the angle of the chimney pipe. He crouched down and pressed his knuckles against the stone floor shelf. He stood up. He looked at the thermometer. He looked at the stove. He looked at the 14 by 18-foot chamber that had held 2 children and 1 woman through 39 below zero temperatures on 6 logs in a single night. He removed his hat. "I was wrong," he said. Clara nodded once. She returned to the stocking. That was enough. Nils Bauer filed his seizure paperwork on December 2nd, as he had promised he would. On December 11th, 2 days after the storm broke, a representative from the Deseret Land and Cattle Company rode out from Salt Lake City to inspect the property and begin the formal process. He found the 40 acres in good order. He found the structure in the hill. He stayed for 40 minutes, asked 3 questions, and rode back to Salt Lake City. The paperwork was quietly withdrawn the following week. No announcement was made. No apology was offered. The company simply moved on to other business, and Nils Bauer did not mention the Engstrom lease again that winter or any winter after it. Desmond Holt came back on December 14th. He brought a notebook this time. He sat on the wooden stool near the stove, and he asked Clara questions for 2 hours, and he wrote down everything she said in a careful hand. He asked about the tunnel angle, and she told him 12 degrees. He asked about the ceiling height, and she told him 6 feet 4 inches. He asked about the mortar mixture, and she described the clay and straw ratio her father had taught her, and he wrote it down word for word. He had built 31 structures across Utah Territory and survived 19 winters, and he sat in that chamber with his notebook open on his knee like a student at his first lesson. He did not find it shameful. That was the thing Clara noticed most. He simply wanted to know. The Halvorsen family came in January. Lars Halvorsen had spent the December storm burning through his entire winter wood supply in 11 days, and had sent his son to borrow from 3 neighbors, and had still finished the storm with his family in coats inside the house. He came to Clara on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands, and asked if she would walk the hill behind his property with him. She did. She showed him where to break ground. She showed him how to read the slope for the right thickness of earth above the chamber. She told him about the frost line and the sandstone shelf and the birch bark and the tunnel angle. She told him everything without holding anything back, the same way her father had told her, standing in the wood shavings with her small feet, because knowledge kept to yourself was just pride wearing a useful coat. Lars Halvorsen broke ground in February. He finished his chamber by April. The following winter, he burned 19 logs in a single month to hold 43 degrees inside, while the valley outside dropped to 31 below. By the spring of 1887, 3 more families in Harmon Flats had begun their own chambers. Each one came to Clara individually on their own morning with their own hat in their hands. She walked the hill with each of them. She answered every question. She never charged anything. By the winter of 1887, the design had reached settlements in Sanpete County to the south and Morgan County to the north. A letter came from a woman in Colville who had read a description of the Engstrom chamber in a church newsletter and wanted to know more. Clara wrote back 4 pages in her careful schoolroom script and sent it without keeping a copy. She did not need the copy. She knew everything it contained. By 1889, variations of the design were being built in 3 counties of Idaho Territory and in the high valleys of western Colorado, where the winters came early and stayed long. The specific numbers traveled with the design. 14 feet by 18 feet. 9 feet down to the stone shelf. 12 degrees on the tunnel angle. 18 inches of packed earth above the birch bark. 6 logs for a night that would have cost 40 in a timber cabin. The math spoke for itself wherever it went, and it needed no one to argue on its behalf. Clara Engstrom lived in the chamber through the winter of 1886 and the winter of 1887. In the spring of 1888, she built a small timber addition onto the front of the hill, a room with 2 windows and a proper door, and she used the chamber behind it as what it had always been, a place that held the earth's own warmth against whatever the sky chose to send. Birk grew tall and took over the fence mending. Astrid learned her father's handwriting from the letters he had left in a tin box and practiced it until her own script looked like his, which was a thing she had decided to do for reasons she never explained and did not need to. The debt of $230 was paid in full by March of 1887, partly from a cordwood business Clara started that winter, selling split wood to the families who had not yet built their chambers and needed something to burn in the meantime. The irony of that was not lost on her. She did not mention it to anyone. The chamber still stands in the hill behind the old Engstrom property in what is now Juab County, Utah. The sandstone walls have not shifted. The tunnel entrance is smaller now, the earth having settled around it over 130 years, but the angle of the dig is still visible in the slope of the floor. Someone placed a hand-lettered sign beside the entrance sometime in the early 20th century. It has been replaced twice since then. It reads simply, Engstrom Winter Chamber, 1886. The name of the woman who built it. The year she built it. Nothing more is needed. What Clara Engstrom did in that hill was not complicated. She remembered something her father told her when she was small, and she trusted it when everything around her was telling her not to. The ground does not care what has happened to you. It does not ask what you have lost or how far you have fallen. It holds the same temperature for the desperate and the determined alike. The difference between the families who froze that December and the family that did not was not strength or wealth or the right connections. It was one woman who remembered something true and refused to let embarrassment talk her out of using it. Sometimes the knowledge that saves you is not new. Sometimes it is very old. Sometimes it has been waiting in you since childhood, in the words of someone who loved you, patient as the ground itself, waiting for the winter that would finally make it necessary. If you want more forgotten stories of courage from the American frontier, subscribe. These histories deserve to be remembered.